Welcome everyone. I think we've sorted out our technical difficulties. My name is Nicholas Galendez.
And Jennifer Domain.
We are Cannabis Legal Group. Welcome to Cannabis Live, episode number 79, Driving Under the Influence of Marijuana. We're going to discuss today some of the product recall advisories that have been released by the Bureau of Marijuana Regulation, as well as retesting and remediation as it pertains to retesting and how to fix your products. And then we're really going to dive into what's been kind of circling in the news media more recently as to the survey that had to do with cannabis and driving while impaired or under the influence, and whether or not that makes sense based on the laws and the different ways that we can measure certain things happening related to that.
Yes, absolutely. So first things first, before we really dive in, is that we have our first licensing board meeting of the year next week on January 16th. We don't know how many applicants the state is going to take yet, but I'm hopeful that it's going to be a rather robust meeting because the state needs to fill some of the gaps that were created by these temporary operators being recently shut down. So we're very hopeful that it'll be a robust agenda, but right now you can tune in on Facebook Live. They've been broadcasting those on Facebook Live recently, and of course we'll be providing updates once we have more information after the licensing meeting.
So I guess the first thing going on the show is just to talk a little bit about the product recalls that we've been having recently to start off the year. The first one of those happened on January 4th, and it was kind of in conjunction with the Bureau of Marijuana Regulation. It's hard to change that up.
Yes.
But them and the particular facility itself had issued a voluntary recall for product that had gotten released without being tested. I think that was potentially an issue with the resolution that the board had passed in early December having to do with, you could buy things from caregivers at a certain point, and then that cut off at the beginning of the year, and afterwards only product could be tested or sold if it had been tested by a testing lab. So perhaps something got through on accident, and they wanted to make sure that those were returned in order to potentially retest or remediate that particular issue with those products. But the other two that came out yesterday affected two different facilities and a wide variety, it seems like, of the flower product.
Right.
And they did involve testing failures for total yeast, mold, chemical residue, bacteria, coliforms, and there are certain different ways, depending on the product and what stage it's in and what the failed test is for, that we're kind of going to factor into whether or not you're able to retest it, whether you're able to fix the failed test and actually get it to the shelves or to the next facility.
Right. So we have an example of what a public health and safety bulletin looks like. And so these are the documents that the state releases when they are issuing a recall. And so we can see that it talks about the processor license number. So it's got the batch numbers, it's got the different names of the types of strains that are have gone wrong, and it'll tell you where they came from. One of the things that the state is doing is they're posting this on their website, so you can always go on their website and see the different public health advisory bulletins and check your product. But it also gives a directive to the provisioning centers that they have to then contact the patients and caregivers who purchase those products and advise them that that issue is being recalled. So we are seeing these safety features being implemented, and it'll be interesting to see how this develops, especially as we're very likely going to see some more recalls as things start to pan out moving forward with this commercial system. But it's very interesting seeing the first couple come out.
Mm-hmm. And I think definitely from a public health and safety standpoint, the Bureau and MARA want to work with both the consumer end, patients and caregivers as it stands now, and the licensed facilities in order to best make sure that these recalls happen for the safety of individuals who could potentially get sick from the chemical residue or the bacteria, E. coli, and a lot of dangerous potential things that you could be putting into your body can get returned properly and retested and either destroyed or sent back out once they reach those safe levels. But I also think for facilities and hopeful licensees that this is also on your minds as far as this is something that could potentially happen to anyone. It does cause some concern for liability reasons. I mean, you wouldn't want to sell a product that causes a lot of harm to anyone. And so, running a tight ship, being compliant, making sure that you follow the rules to a T. It's on the whole industry as well with the safety compliance labs accurately testing and making sure that all of the test results are done in accordance with the procedures that the Bureau has instilled is definitely going to make a safer, more regulated, efficient industry going forward. And I think that kind of goes well into our next subtopic before we talk about driving while high is the retesting and remediation advisory bulletin that Laura posted as well this year, having to do with the permanent rules and the different types of products and at what stages and what failed tests kind of trigger different retesting methods, remediation procedures for potentially getting them back on the shelves.
Absolutely. So one of the things that is certainly nice about this advisory bulletin is it's not just like, oh, they failed one test, we have to destroy everything. So they give a couple of steps that these labs have to follow in order to make sure that a product truly needs to be destroyed, or if it passes a couple of extra tests, then it is able to be sold. So it kind of outlines the general process. So if there's a failed test for product, that item has to be put into quarantine, right? You can't, have it with everything else. It has to be quarantined, and then you can retest it. It has to pass 2 subsequent tests in order to be put out for market. It cannot fail either of those tests. If it does, then it may have to be destroyed. It depends on the type of product that you're working with as to whether it can be sent out for remediation to destroy bacteria, or if it's a chocolate and maybe we'll just send it back for being melted down and then adding more just regular chocolate and less cannabis product, and maybe reduce the level of THC content in there. But it kind of gives you some specific guidelines on how you can fix a product before it necessarily has to be destroyed. So that's nice.
Yeah, and just by way of example, if it's usable marijuana, the flower, the shaker, the trim, if there's mold or some type of foreign matter on it, they allow the grower to remove and kind of destroy those contaminated parts, and then it needs to be retested. If there's more water activity within than is allowable, then they're allowed to let it dry and cure more and then be retested. For microbials, something that's interesting but makes sense is that, if you're transferring that product to a processor, you have to get the permission of the Bureau. And then, if it has to do with microbials, yeast, mold, E. coli, as long as that package is going to be heated up to a very high level and extracted with a hydrocarbon-based solvent, presumably killing all of those different kinds of microbials, you'll be able to have that retested and kind of brought back into the system and along through the process. Same thing goes with concentrates, extracts, and edibles. If there's too many solvents, you can further extract it. If it doesn't, isn't 100% uniform or doesn't meet those criteria, you can remix it and have it retested. And then as Jennifer mentioned with potency, if your chocolate bars are too strong, you'd be able to kind of remelt them in, add some more cacao beans and whatever, vanilla and all those nice yummy ingredients that you'd be putting into these edible products and different other types of marijuana products, and then have it retested so that it meets those potency limits. So there's definitely ways for you licensees to remediate certain failed tests, but there's also some prohibitions on retesting, which include, if a product is in its final package, unfortunately the Bureau and the regulators have said that you cannot have that retested and it must be destroyed. The same thing for if the test fails for chemical residue, either in terms of the amount or if there's any impermissible active ingredients, potential pesticides that have been banned by the Bureau. And then if there are microbials within infused products, meaning basically they've already been infused and there's still those types of bacteria and microbes in it, you have to destroy the product. So just to go along with the recalls, there's ways for it to be retested, for licensees to fix the issues that once were present to get it on the shelves for consumers.
Absolutely. So along to our feature highlight today, talking about driving while under the influence of marijuana. This has become a huge topic right now, big conversation piece in the news, because there was recently this study that was just released, and it's from the University of Michigan, and it talks about how Michigan medical marijuana users are driving while high, and it appears to be a self-reported study. So over almost 800 medical marijuana patients reported that they 56% drive while high within 2 years, within 2 hours of consuming marijuana. 51% said they drove while a little high, and 21% reported that they drive while very high. Now, Nick, I haven't seen anything about what that means. What does driving while a little high mean versus what does driving really high mean? Have you seen anything about that?
And I know you mentioned we'd be stirring the pot.
Yes.
I know that our listeners and viewers have a lot of burning questions that, want to make sure that this whole license system and adult use marijuana laws don't go up in smoke. So
right.
One thing we have to talk about when we talk about studies like this is the types of controls and the types of things that these studies don't say versus what's necessarily reported in the media as clickbait, as a way to get more readership in. So it is a study. It was done by the highly respected University of Michigan. It will be published, or was published, in the Drug and Alcohol Dependence Journal. But it was kind of as you said, self-reported study. So when you're self-reporting, I don't want to say that it's not necessarily a science, but what a little high and very high might be for myself might be very different than that for Jennifer and for the next person and the next person. So, while it didn't really have a lot of criteria to go off of, at least scientifically, it was self-reported. It was from 2014 to 2015 regarding their driving habits for the past 6 months.
Right.
And so you can use that data at least to get a little bit of initial baseline as to how many are reporting that they're doing this and how they felt. But that necessarily doesn't mean X person was driving Y impaired. Certainly driving under we drive under the influence of drugs all the time. Hopefully that's not a surprise to anyone, but if you go to Starbucks and get coffee, Tim Hortons, if you eat a donut in the morning, right, you're driving under the influence of sugar, caffeine. If you take prescription medication in the morning, which it does say, do not take unless you have tested this and can drive without being impaired and not operate heavy machinery. But we are under the influence of a lot of molecules, to say the least, right, at very different times. And it's kind of about understanding how those molecules and different substances affect our bodies, whether or not they're similar or different, which really kind of adds to the question as to how that should be governed, what limits should be put on there. Does driving while high, does driving while impaired or under the influence or intoxicated by that substance really, what does that really mean and how does that really affect things?
Right, exactly. So before we really kind of talk about different studies and what the testing might look like, I just want to take a quick big picture look at what the law says. So from the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, which has that patient caregiver model, the law says that you cannot operate a vehicle while under the influence. It doesn't define what under the influence means, but it does say you cannot operate a motor vehicle while under the influence. And then we have this new adult use law that says that we can possess it and we can consume it. Before we had that law, there was a zero tolerance policy, right? We can't operate a vehicle. That's very well understood. You cannot operate a vehicle. But now with this, it's understood that people are going to be consuming cannabis and people are going to be driving, and hopefully not at the same time, but the new law says that you cannot operate a vehicle while under the influence. And so what we're struggling with right now is figuring out how to test for being impaired and what that's going to look like under state law, and how this substance, while we're testing for it, people are trying to compare it to alcohol. And alcohol makes sense because we have been saying let's regulate cannabis or marijuana like alcohol. That's what the ballot initiative was called. But it's not the same substance, and it interacts with our bodies in a different way. So we need to be cognizant of how that substance is interacting with us and how we're testing for it. So maybe looking for like a blood alcohol content for alcohol might not be the same as looking for a level of impairment with cannabis. So Nick, can you talk about a little bit with like the safety concerns and the difference between safety concerns for cannabis and then driving while under the influence with alcohol and how those might be different?
Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that at least the Michigan courts and legislature has struggled with since the MMA. As Jennifer mentioned, prior to that, it was a zero tolerance policy. If you had any molecule or percentage of cannabis in your system, you were considered to be driving while impaired and in violation of the motor vehicle code. Since then, the under the influence legal term of art came into play. There was a court case in 2013, at least discussing that as it pertained to patients, and it did urge the legislature to come up with a potential limitation as to what they considered to be under the influence, something of a baseline, and within that language they said it meant something more than having any amount, and it at least requires some effect on the person. And that kind of goes into alcohol, blood alcohol content versus the presence of THC, active THC within your system. We have the 0.08 blood alcohol content. As far as testing for alcohol goes, we have the field sobriety test. We measure your blood alcohol concentration, which is an estimated degree of intoxication. And so, the concentration of alcohol in your breath, grams of alcohol per milliliter of blood. And there have been studies by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that show that increased levels of impairedness are linked to blood alcohol content, which then can lead to fatal accidents, decrease in psychomotor skills, and a lot of things that really, at least more so, justify the 0.08 percentage, at least here in Michigan, than it would for potentially a cannabis nanogram limit, which we'll go into later. But aside from that, I know there's issues with breathalyzers, for example, with the calibration of them, how regularly they're tested and calibrated and serviced, how precise they are, how reliable, whether they even really, again, it varies from person to person, but whether it really measures being under the influence or driving while impaired or intoxicated by. And so even though there's some debate as to whether or not the limits we have for alcohol are meaningful and really indicate what they do or are supposed to stand for, there at least is some scientific justification for those types of interactions and those types of limits based on the knowledge that we have, which I feel like is a little bit different for cannabis.
Right. So cannabis, as we've been discussing, and as I'm sure many of you know, is a completely different beast. And so we're working with this substance and we're trying to figure out what is the best way to determine if somebody is truly impaired. And a couple of the most popular suggestions being bounced around right now is to have what's called drug recognition experts who are trained to identify signs of impairment. So this might be, the state police officers or sheriffs, deputies who are trained to identify signs of impairment. And this is a good start. However, it is not necessarily foolproof. I mean, and much like a field sobriety test, this is relative to human error. If a deputy might think that you're, trying to be funny and you're trying to be funny and the deputy thinks that you're really impaired, like that's not going to go well for you. It is also something that's open to more interpretation. It's more subjective. So I kind of have an issue with the drug recognition experts out there on the street. I would like to see, if they're going to do that, have some sort of like body cam on or something where we can see footage of what this person actually looked like. I think that would have sort of like a checks and balances system with these drug recognition experts. I have to memorize that name, drug recognition expert, by seeing some sort of check and balance system there is going to be really important.
And I think that's where we get into testing.
Right.
Roadside testing was a pilot program in 4 counties in Michigan. It's gone statewide now, which involves a swab for saliva, which can indicate the presence of THC in your saliva, which could then be used as the basis for a blood test, which could then measure the amount of THC in your bloodstream in nanograms per milliliter. And again, similar states have imposed limits of either 0.05 or 0.10 as a basis, as a standard for whether or not a person at least has the criteria for being impaired or intoxicated. But really, there's a struggle even in those states and arguments against doing that for several reasons that I think have verifiably scientific roots coming from there as to why those shouldn't be imposed and why those amounts and those thresholds don't necessarily match up as well as it would for blood alcohol concentration when you have alcohol concern. So, cannabis is different than alcohol. Imposing a limit similar to 0.08 really, I think, based on the studies I've read and seen, wouldn't justify, have as much of a causal link between impairment or intoxication as the 0.08 for alcohol does. Cannabis can, and I mean, we're not here to sugarcoat it, but cannabis does affect you as a person, psychomotor performance. It can increase weaving. You can have decreased hand-eye coordination. Interestingly enough, though, some studies have shown that it does increase reaction time, though. So, certain effects of cannabis depend on the user. I think more so even than alcohol, where newer users, it can impact those. If you're, using higher potency wax or just higher potency products, or mixing with other substances such as prescription drugs or alcohol. But what we've seen through the studies is that heavier users do develop a different tolerance, even more so than say heavily dependent alcoholic would for alcohol. And I think across the board, overall, the effects are shorter and more subtle for cannabis as it pertains to alcohol. So when you think about imposing a nanogram limit for cannabis as opposed to a blood alcohol concentration for alcohol, you have to really think about these things when you're into the process when you're thinking of a limit. Because if it affects people differently, if it isn't standardized or generally standardizable between different segments of users and strengths and types of product that you're consuming, then maybe having that standard doesn't make sense. But the drug recognition experts coupled with roadside testing are things that can lead to then, having that objective kind of science-backed reason as in your blood. But if that doesn't causally relate to your impairment, then or being under the influence, then I think that's where a lot of people run into that issue with actually establishing that baseline. And also, just to kind of close that off, there's the difference between alcohol and cannabis as to what we've seen is that cannabis consumption leads to less aggressive driving, slower speeds, as I mentioned, increased stopping distance, and actually greater self-awareness. And also, we'd be happy to kind of put together a link of some of these studies that we are using this information from, just so we're not just making this up just for the sake of having a good argument for it. There are studies that have been tested, limited in nature because of the federal prohibition, but there are studies in some states where cannabis has been legal and used for medical or adult use purposes that do back up these studies.
Right. So these studies that we want to cite to are different, and they talk a lot about odds ratio. So for those of you who might not know what an odds ratio is, because I certainly didn't before I started reading these, is it estimates the probability that a certain event is going to occur over like a certain variable. So if you have an odds ratio and you're driving and you're driving, you're sober, you're not under the influence of cannabis, you are just driving normally, what is your odds ratio that you are going to be in an accident? And so that number would be 1. If you add a variable, then the more likely you are to get into an accident, that number goes up. So 1 is your baseline, and the higher the number that goes, the more that variable is going to affect your ability to get into an accident. If the number goes lower or remains closer to 1, it doesn't really have an effect, or it has a negative effect. So what we're looking for is, if it's a high number, then that is really going to increase your chances of getting into an accident. So we make sure to adjust for age in these studies. We make sure to adjust for gender in these studies, because I'm not trying to stereotype. This is scientifically shown that younger men generally are a little bit more risky drivers than middle-aged women, for example. That being said, if you adjust the variables for cannabis usage across age and across gender, we don't really see a significant increase in the likelihood to get into a fatal vehicle accident. So that is shown in multiple studies. We also have a couple of other variables that show that if you're driving with 2 or more passengers, your risk of going into an accident, a fatal accident, increases 2-fold. If you are driving while pregnant, and I kind of have a pushback against this as a woman, but if you're driving while pregnant, you actually have a 42% increase in the likelihood of getting into an accident. So, I mean, that's statistically significant, and that's just by being pregnant. And then certainly texting while driving, it's 4-fold, 4 times more likely to get into an accident. And versus marijuana, I think it's only like an odds ratio of like 1.05 if adjusted for age and gender.
Depending which study you look for, the baseline is 1. Cannabis users were anywhere between 1 plus to maybe 1.3, which really did not lead to statistically significant findings, as opposed to driving with a passenger while pregnant or while texting. And I think the joke, when we heard this presentation from Paula Hurtado of Normal, which was very helpful and kind of helped us get our mind around all these different statistics, is that, nobody's banning pregnant women from driving. Nobody's saying, this is a big danger for us, but, even just without being under the influence of anything else, as a baseline, just that having that characteristic leads to almost a 50% increase in your likelihood to have an accident. Driving while texting obviously is a little bit more severe of an example, but it is severe because it does lead to 4 times that amount of an odds ratio, looking down at your phone, texting while driving, and that is banned, and that can be a civil infraction or more. And so at least on, from that end, for it being that high, that justifies a zero tolerance policy for texting while driving. It justifies civil infractions and other penalties for it. The tricky thing is, again, with those odds ratios not really matching up or being that high for cannabis, it's still a question of, okay, so should we have that baseline, that threshold, when it doesn't link up and match, a certain amount leading to driving under the influence. So I think that is an issue. In terms of crash fatality rates anyway, the kind of stereotype is that more people are going to smoke now. There's going to be more people driving who are high, which is going to lead to more accidents, which means that marijuana is dangerous, which means that people shouldn't be driving while they're high. And while we agree people should not be driving under the influence, what we've seen is that actually, in those states that have legalized adult use cannabis, some reports might say that traffic crashes and fatalities have gone up. But if you look at the entire nation overall, traffic fatalities and traffic accidents are going up regardless of cannabis being present. So it may be the case that more users who didn't try it before are trying cannabis. I'd say that it didn't open up the floodgates, and it's not like there was a whole crowd of people that were just waiting to do this, but it was illegal, and now they are, and now they're smoking it and driving all over the place, all goofy and acting all weird and getting into crashes. And so it's more the case that more people are just getting into accidents generally. And so in order to really come to a conclusion, you need to control for that variable that just accidents are increasing generally, not necessarily as a causation variable because of cannabis.
Right, absolutely. So, like he said, we're seeing some data from other states, Washington, Colorado, that these fatality rates are not statistically significant compared to non-adult use states. And then we also have to look at these ideas that if more people are consuming, that could be leading to it, but odds are that's not really a major factor here. We have studies that show that there's not a statistically significant number of people who are now suddenly interested in trying cannabis because it's legalized. It might attract some new users, but it's not like it's opening the floodgates here. And then keep in mind that when you test for THC in a system, it can be tested for up to several days that it's in your system. So we're seeing law enforcement test more regularly, certainly. We're seeing more people test positive for THC in their system, certainly. It's going to be in your system for several days. But we really need to think critically about how a testing process is going to look, roadside, as well as, you know, if we're going to do a blood sample, something like that for convictions. And we also need to think critically about these studies when they're issued. What was the sample size? What were the variables? Was this controlled for age and gender? Was this a self-reporting study? Was this a study that was done over time, where they followed up with a set of individuals over time? So we really need to think critically about what these studies are saying, and then keep our scope out to see what other studies are saying in response to that. So I think that those are some of the really big lessons that we can learn. And of course, this is going to be an evolving conversation. There's constantly debates on what these drug testing procedures are going to look like for cannabis. We haven't figured it out yet, but it's going to be it's an evolving process, certainly. And I'm really excited to see where that discussion goes forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, just to kind of close off, you know, the whole data with increased use and increased traffic related incidents related to cannabis consumption, you know, might mean something, they might not. You know, these news articles that say more than 50% of people are driving high, that might be the case. But what these studies don't really tell us is whether they were driving while high under the influence of cannabis. And as Jennifer mentioned, you know, there's a lot of questions and a lot of scientific research that needs to go into this in order to make a really sound and safe and reliable and accurate and precise method for actually testing impairment. Because as that study shows, it was self-reporting. A lot of the headlines can be a little misleading, but even if those 21% of medical marijuana patients back in 2014 or 2015 said that they drove, you know, very high, they might have self-reported that and they might have thought that they were very high. But even that in and of itself doesn't really say if they were driving impaired or under the influence or intoxicated. Those are all feelings, and those feelings can be wrong. And just as drug recognition experts, you know, perceptions can be different, and different people's reactions to different substances can be different. You know, we're all working towards making something that is reliable and able to be, you know, to hold people to criminal laws that they're committing. We want to make sure we're doing that in the most reasonable and you know, way that makes sense as possible. So I think that's something that we're all going to keep trying to work towards, and hopefully, you know, the legislature and all the interested parties will come together, voice their opinions, and really make sure that we're all heard from different perspectives, you know, from the science community and beyond, to really working towards a number that makes sense for Michigan.
Absolutely. So I'm seeing that a lot of you were asking questions. We are going to be answering your questions if we didn't already answer them. So we'll make sure to comment underneath and answer any questions that we didn't catch during the live streaming. If you have other questions, feel free to comment and we'll address those as well. As always, it's a pleasure and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
See you next week, and please be safe and do not drive under the influence of anything.
Yes.